All right, so yeah, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off with our featured guest speaker today, who is Tony Ortega. Many of you are sure already very familiar with him. But yeah, so he's the former editor-in-chief of The Village Voice, former executive editor, rawstory.com, and current executive editor of The Lip TV. So he also just recently released his book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, and which he will be talking about today. So please welcome our guest speaker, Tony Ortega.
Thank you very much, Vic, and the Humanists of Houston. Great venue. I love this venue. And it's very nice to see it filled so full. Houston has outdone Dallas. Don't you like hearing that? Although I had a very, very nice venue in Dallas. It was wonderful, but it's great to see such a big crowd. I think this is my third trip to Houston, and seeing this crowd, I'm starting to get some idea why. And I may be wrong, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Houston is the largest city in the world without a Church of Scientology. There is a mission here. There is a mission here, but there is no org. And I was thinking about it, and I cannot think of a larger city in the world without an org that's larger than Houston. So you're doing something right. So yeah, I've been writing about the Church of Scientology for 20 years, and I now have a book out, and I want to tell you about it and about the latest developments in Scientology up to today. And I thought about where I'm going to start, and I think what I'm going to tell you is that 73 years ago today, a man named Chaim Buchholz was pulled off a train and arrested in the city of Antwerp. And he was taken to the Breendonk concentration camp for the crime of being a Jew who was not Belgian. And not too long after that, he was moved to a brand new transit center called Mechelen, which had opened up between Brussels and Antwerp. He was one of the first Jews that were sent there. Mechelen became the largest transit center for Jews sent to Auschwitz in that region. He was among the first to be sent. He was sent to Auschwitz and he was killed. And I realized today is that date, July 22nd, 1942. And what makes that especially difficult for the subject of my book was that she was born on July 26th, 1942. And we didn't find out about Chaim's arrest until we started researching this book. And I had to break it to Paulette Cooper that her father never actually laid eyes on her. She was born 4 days after he was arrested. Her mother, Rukla Minkowski Buchholz, was arrested herself 3 months later because she had been in hiding with her two little girls, and there was somebody in the family bringing her supplies, and that stopped, and she didn't know why. And so she had to risk going into the street to get something for her girls, again, knowing that simply being a foreign Jew in Belgium could get you arrested, and that's what happened. So then the two little girls were not exactly sure how they were kept hidden. There's different stories about that, but they eventually ended up at the Mechelen transit camp themselves. Susie was about 3, Paulette was about 1. And the thing about the Nazis is they were amazing bureaucrats. They kept just detailed records of everything, to the point where we actually have their passenger numbers on the train they were to be sent to Auschwitz on in August 1943. But a month later, there's a record of them in an orphanage. They had not been put on that train. And it turns out that her parents had very good friends that had been unable to do anything about their arrests. But once the little girls were scheduled to be sent to Auschwitz, they did everything they could. They raised money. They raised black market goods. And they were very fortunate that the Mechelen camp was being run by a notoriously corrupt Nazi commandant by the name of Philip Schmidt. He was so corrupt that Nazis had already scheduled him to be transferred. And he was transferred just a month or two after Paulette and Susie were saved. But he was there long enough to accept the bribe, and the girls were moved to an orphanage, and that's how Paulette Cooper survived the Holocaust. She and Susie then lived in a series of at least 4 orphanages that we know of until 1948, when Paulette was adopted by Ted and Stella Cooper. And she flew to Inglewild Airport, which today we call JFK Airport, on August 18th, 1948, one of the hottest days of the year. And she wore a little purple dress and her only possession in the world, which was a toy ball that she'd had for more than a year. And if you know 6-year-olds, it's kind of remarkable that she would hold on to one toy for a year. And they were coming from Amsterdam, which of course is known for its diamonds. And so when she arrived, the customs agents assumed that these 2 Belgians, the woman that was traveling with Paulette, that they were diamond smugglers. And so they were interrogating them in English, and Paulette only spoke French, and the woman she was with only spoke French. And they were insisting that they were hiding something, and they were searching the toy ball. And the story Paulette tells is that this tall man walked into the room in customs and said, "My name is Ted Cooper. This is my daughter. I'm taking her now. And if you have a problem with that, you can talk to my attorney." And he swooped her up in his arms, walked out of the airport. It was the first time she'd ever met her parents, her mother and her father. And she said the first thing she said to them was, "What took you so long to get me?" And it was in French, and they didn't understand. She had a difficult childhood, but soon enough she loved living with them. She became a voracious reader. She knew by 8 that she wanted to be a writer. And I'm sorry she's not with me here tonight. We've been making joint appearances, but you'll fall in love with her. She's amazing. She turned 73 on Sunday. And it's been such a pleasure for me to get to know her. I had known her somewhat over the years. I began writing about Scientology in 1995. I'm from Los Angeles. I had started writing about Scientology in Phoenix. I went back to LA. And it's really fun writing about Scientology in Los Angeles. That's one of the world headquarters. And I got to tell the Tori Christmas story. I got to tell the Graham Barry story. Those names might be familiar to you. And every once in a while, I'd get an email from somebody saying, "Good job, keep going." And the name in the email was Paulette. And I thought, I can't be. Because if you write about Scientology, the question you always get is, are you worried about harassment? Do you know what happened to this woman, Paulette Cooper? She's very well known for what happened to her once she wrote about Scientology. And so I was stunned that in the late 90s, early 2000s, she was sending me emails just encouraging me. And we didn't actually meet until I was the editor of the Village Voice, and we met in December 2011. And that's when she told me that she had no idea how she survived the Holocaust. And so we set out together to find all that information out. And I wrote about that for the Village Voice. And I think that's when we realized, the 2 of us, that there was a larger project here we could do together, and that she trusted me. I mean, she'd been approached by numerous people who wanted to tell her story because it's very famous. And let me tell you the basics if you're not familiar with it. And that is that in 1971, she came out with a book called The Scandal of Scientology. It's not the first book written about Scientology, but it's one of the most well-known, I think because it was a paperback, so it sold a lot. It was very harsh. And almost immediately, Scientology set out to destroy her for doing that. At that time, Scientology's spy wing was known as the Guardian's Office. Now, I don't know how many churches you know have a spy wing, but Scientology has a spy wing, and it used to be called the Guardian's Office. Today it's called the Office of Special Affairs. And the Guardian's Office, L. Ron Hubbard, the founder, had created the Guardian's Office in 1966. And by 1971, it was a very sophisticated intelligence operation. And for various reasons. L. Ron Hubbard really didn't like Paulette Cooper. I think one of the reasons is, a man named George Malko had actually written a very good book about Scientology the year before Paulette did. And like Paulette, his book was immediately sued and became hard to find. But he found out about the lawsuit while he was in the outback in Australia doing another story. He never wrote about Scientology ever again. And I called him, he's now a professor at NYU, and he was not interested in talking about it even today. Paulette, on the other hand, after her book came out, she went on television, she went on the radio, she helped other journalists do their stories about Scientology. And we're very fortunate that the FBI raided the Guardian's office in 1977 because we have their documents showing how they planned to destroy Paulette. And you can see that they're exasperated. They had sued her. They spread slander about her sex life around New York City. They looked into destroying her father's her father's business. And nothing stopped her. And you can see the officials in the Guardian's office, who is this person? Why won't she stop? How do we stop her? And I think that's what really made them take it to another level. At one point in 1972, one of the operatives says, "It's time to get her committed." And what they did was they got her fingerprint on a piece of paper and typed up a bomb threat to themselves and mailed it to themselves. They then called the FBI and told them that we think this was sent to us by Paulette Cooper. Even though it was illiterate, it doesn't sound anything like the way Paulette writes. And they sent a couple of the threats to themselves. In May 1973, she was indicted and faced 15 years in federal prison and a $15,000 fine. And trial was scheduled for October 31st, 1973. And she was determined to kill herself if that trial started. She's explained to me that this indictment did not become public, but she knew that the moment it did, her life would be over, her career would be over. She was especially sensitive to what her parents thought of her adoptive parents. And she began storing Valium over the summer of '73, determined to end her life if it came to it. And this is how sophisticated and insidious Scientology spy wing was. They not only had framed her for a felony, but they wanted to get some sense of what she was going through. So from May to September 1973, as she was facing this indictment, they managed to send in several people to befriend her without her knowing they were Scientology spies. And one of them actually moved into her apartment with her. And he lived with her from May to September 1973, sending back reports to Scientology every day about what she was going through. So not only had they put her in a situation, they wanted to hear how she was dealing with it. And he would encourage her to come up to the roof of the Churchill building, which is a 34-story building on the east side of Manhattan. And she showed me this ledge that there's a nice deck up there and a pool. And at this time, this was the spring of 1973, and that's right when the World Trade Center was opened. And he would jump up on this little ledge with a sheer drop and would, "Come on up, Paulette, come on up." And he would tell her, "If you can't do this, how can you stand up to those bastards at Scientology?" And she tells me she's really convinced that he wanted her to get up there to help her have a little accident. We don't have any proof of that, but she really believed that was the case. But there's no doubt that he was reporting on her. He called himself Jerry Levin. One of the things I wanted to do in this book, like I said, people generally know the outline of what happened to Paulette. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized there were a lot of gaps, a lot of contradictory information online. Wikipedia said that Paulette was born in Auschwitz, for example. It was completely wrong. And so these were all these things I wanted to solve, some mysteries, fill in some information. But number one, I wanted to figure out who was Jerry Levin. Who was this guy that could live with her day in and day out for 4 months and be cool as a cucumber? And we found him. It took a while. in order to do that, I reached out to as many former Guardian's Office spies as possible, which isn't easy, but I found several of them. Some of them wouldn't talk to me. Some of them still don't like Paulette. But a few of them realized that enough time has gone by that they'd be willing to talk to me. And all of the Guardian's Office operatives who would speak with me told them they had no doubt that Jerry Levin had to be Don Alverso. So if you're familiar with Scientology's big spy operation called the Snow White program, which to this day is the largest infiltration of the US federal government in this country's history, pulled off by the Church of Scientology in the 70s, Don Alverso was one of the spies that helped break into government offices. He was kind of he was the breaking and entering man. And all of the Guardian's Office former spies that I talked to said only Don Alverso was cool enough to pull off this kind of an operation. The problem was Don Alverso was a fake name. And they didn't know the guy's real name. The FBI didn't know his real name. All we knew was that Jerry Levin had told Paulette he was a combat pilot in Vietnam. Don Alverso had told his colleagues that he was a combat pilot in Vietnam. But we didn't know who this person was. And then I got a break, relatively late in the project. A woman named Karen De La Carriere, who's a very well-known former Scientologist, remembered that when she was married in 1978, one of her bridesmaids was Molly Alverso. And Karen knew her actual maiden name. So she had a friend who was a private investigator, and Karen asked him, could you find us as much information as you can on Molly? And he found a trove of information about her and found that she had been married to the same man over a long period of time. Well, that man has to be Don Alverso. So now I had his real name, which I'm not going to say out loud here, but you can find it really easily online because we've put it on there. But I'm being careful for reasons. But we had found the man who was Don Alverso, and it turns out he's in Long Island, not too far from me. Works at a family building equipment store. So I looked around and I actually found a photograph of him from 2002. Showed it to one of the Guardian's Office operatives. He said, no question, that's Don. So, wow, we got it. We have figured out who was the elusive Don Alverso. I showed the picture to Paulette. She said, that guy's old and fat. I said, I know, Paulette, but you need to subtract 40 years. And she looked at it and she said, I guess it could be. I said, no, that's not good enough. So I got really lucky. There's another researcher who's really skilled. Her name is Virginia McClary. She was interested in this as well, and she tracked down a picture of this guy from 1968, right when he got his Army flying wings, which allowed him to become a combat pilot in Vietnam, just as Don Alverso had said, just as Jerry Levin had said. Showed this picture to the GO people. Again, no question, that's Don Alverso. Crossed my fingers, showed it to Paulette, and she said, hey, that's Jerry Levin. So we got it. So I called him. It took a while because he doesn't work at this place every day. And I got him on the phone, and I said, look, and this is the same thing I told all the other GO people. I said, look, it's been 40 years. I hope enough time has passed now that you'd be interested in talking about the work you did for the Guardian's Office. And, with Paulette Cooper, I'm writing a book about Paulette Cooper and those days. And he said, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? I said, Guardian's Office, Scientology, New York Org, B1, Snow White. And he said, I don't know what language you're speaking. I'm sorry, you must have the wrong person. And I told my best GO source, who knew him the best, about that conversation. He said, yep, that's Don Alverso. So we know we have this guy 5 different ways. I really wish he had talked. One of the Guardian's Office sources told me that he was willing to talk to me as long as I didn't try to convince him that Paulette was a good person. And I said, that's not my role. I'm a journalist. I want to know what you know. I'm not trying to convince you of something. And that's why when you read this book, I hope you keep in mind, this is not Paulette Cooper's memoir. This is my history. I didn't just accept anything Paulette told me. I went and checked things out and did the best I could. When we first started, how she first got interested in Scientology, she had left BBDO, the advertising firm. She was one of the first copywriters on Madison Avenue. In fact, she always says that Peggy Olson is a fictional representation of her. She's very disappointed that it's being played by a Scientologist. But that was her life in 1966, 67, and then she got out of that. What she really wanted to do was become a magazine writer. And one day, one of the men she knew at BBDO came over to see her, and he had gotten into Scientology, and he told her something very strange. He told her, in Scientology, one of the things you do is you go into past lives to find out who you were, and he had found out that he was Jesus Christ. Now see, L. Ron Hubbard was very smart. One of the strict rules in Scientology is you cannot discuss your case, because otherwise if they did, they'd realize that half of them all think they were Jesus Christ. But anyway, she thought that was very strange, and she knew another guy at BBDO, a guy she'd actually dated, had introduced this other guy to Scientology. So she called him up, and she said, I hope you can explain this to me. Our friend thinks he's Jesus Christ. And this other guy said, well, maybe he is. And that's when she realized, I got to look into this Scientology thing. And so she scheduled a trip to the local org to do classes. And that's how she first got into all this. And I told her that one of the first things I wanted to do in this project is I wanted to find those two guys. And she said, Tony, it's been 45 years. I don't know where these guys are. You're never going to find them. Even if you found them, they're not going to want to talk for a book. And the one probably still hates my guts. I said, look, let me at least try. And I actually found them pretty easily. It was not that difficult. Luckily, their names were not too common. And I managed to find them both. I explained what I was doing, and they were willing to talk to me. And the one had been a spy for Scientology for years and had actually helped them in their campaigns against Paulette. But he understood that I was, I'm a journalist trying to get the whole thing down. I'm not, trying to punish him or anything like that. And it went really well. And I think Paulette was very surprised that they decided to talk to me. And the best thing for me was their accounts completely matched hers. And that's a good feeling when you're an author, that you know that your source has a good memory and remembers things the way other people do. So that was one of the first things we did, and I was thrilled. Other times, a lot of time had passed, and Paulette would tell me something, and then I would come to her with a draft, and she said, that's not what I told you. I said, I know, because I went and I found a deposition you gave 30 years ago, and I'm going with the deposition. So, because you know how it is. If you try to remember what you said in the deposition 30 years ago. So I did the best I could as far as putting together documents, talking to the people that were there, talking to the Guardian's office, and I think what we came up with is a frightening tale of what it was like to be Paulette Cooper and go through this. She thought about suicide, she was indicted, they ran multiple operations. We even learned about operations they ran against her she had no idea of. I'll never forget one day I was in Florida spending time with her and just asking her how things were going at that time. And she mentioned that whenever she comes to New York, she always meets with a particular Vanity Fair reporter. And they end up always talking about Scientology, and for years they have. And at that point she stopped and she noticed my jaw had dropped open. And she said, what is it? And I said, you haven't heard that he was outed as a Scientology spy? And sure enough, the top former leaders of Scientology who came out recently, Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder, had made it public that this Vanity Fair reporter has been on the payroll of the Church of Scientology for years. And it was his job to ask other reporters what they were working on. And whenever Paulette came to New York, he would meet with her and quiz her about Scientology. And Paulette and I believe this is actually how the Church of Scientology first found out about Janet Reitman's book, was through Paulette. So Robert Kaufman, who also wrote about the church in the 70s, told Paulette, it doesn't matter if you go away, they will always have someone on you. And we know that was true at least until 2010. They're still keeping tabs on her. So I think she's a really brave lady, and I'm grateful to her that she kept quiet for 2 years while I did this book, and now she's come with me on several appearances. In the middle of May, we did one of our first at the Steve Allen Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, and we were 2 blocks away from Big Blue, Scientology's headquarters in Los Angeles, where the FBI raided in July 1977. And they were there to raid Scientology because, like I said, Scientology had been caught burglarizing federal offices. And that's what they were searching for records for, is evidence that hundreds of spies had gotten jobs at the IRS, Department of Treasury, and had been breaking into courthouses and had been stealing documents by the yard. And so they raided the church in DC and 2 places in Los Angeles, took more than 100,000 documents, and took them back and started sifting through them with tons of evidence of these burglary jobs. But they also kept running into documents about a Miss Lovely. And these were the planning documents to try to destroy Paulette, and that's how we got our title, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, which came from my publisher, Humphrey. I like to give him a shout out because he not only gave me the title, but when I first started writing about it, I sent some pages to him. He said, no, don't write it like that. And he's the one that told me, write it as if it's happening. So if you've read the book, you know I'm so indebted to him because it makes it more fun. It kind of unfolds like a novel, and people who liked the book told me they really enjoyed that. And so I had a lot of fun putting all these different things together. It was at times difficult. Paulette doesn't really actually like talking about 1972 and 1973. Those were extremely difficult years for her. She's still bitter. I mean, she still feels like Scientology stole 15 of her best years. And she, you can see in the book that she went from journalist to activist. She kind of walked into a couple of traps that they set for her. But we talk about the differences between then and now. And I think the main difference is that in 1972, the agents that were sent to smear her, try to ruin her job prospects, ruin her father's, intimidate them, they were young Scientologists, and they really believed in what they were doing. They were sophisticated spies, especially Don Alverso, but for the most part, they were actual church members. And I've talked to one of them, and I asked him, how far do you think you would have gone? And he said, Tony, it's really difficult for me to know how, if they had asked me to commit physical harm, he's not sure he would have turned that down. Today, they employ professionals. They hire private investigators, they hire lawyers, and even Mike Rinder, who was running the Office of Special Affairs, will tell you that the big difference is back then they were wiretapping, they were framing people, they were doing illegal things. Today they go all the way up to that line of illegality in their surveillance and harassment. They know where the line is, they hire professionals, they don't go over it. That's what Mike Rinder would tell you, but now Mike and I both have a different opinion about that, because just recently the U.S. Attorney's Office notified Mike Rinder and myself that we were illegally hacked by a private investigator working for the Church of Scientology. He was just sentenced to prison. The New York Times reported that indeed he was working for the Church of Scientology. And I was notified by the U.S. Attorney literally 10 days after this book came out. And I thought, gosh, the Church of Scientology, they have illegally hacked the guy who wrote the book about their illegal activities 40 years ago. And they want the world to believe that they've changed their ways. I have to thank him for that. That was really well done. Another thing that we were hoping to happen, we hope it would happen in this project was, Paulette was hoping that I'd locate these GO people because she wanted somebody to talk to her and apologize. And like I said, most of the GO people I talk to still hate her guts. But right in the middle of our project, a man came forward and emailed Paulette and said that he'd been carrying around this guilt for 40 years. He had followed her. He had, when Don Alverso had gotten her teenage diary out of her apartment had Xerox pages that had embarrassing things that she'd written at 17 about her parents and about sex. And then this operative, his job was to take those pages and anonymously deliver them to her father's office, just to intimidate them, just to scare them. And he came forward all these years later to apologize to her and said how he'd been carrying around the guilt of that and how just awful he felt. And she put me in touch with him, and I'm really happy he's in the book. His name is Len Zinberg. He's a really wonderful guy. I think it took a lot of guts for him to do that. It meant a lot to Paulette. I just wish some others would. I mean, you know, we're far past the statute of limitations on anything that was done with her. We'll see. Now that the book has come out, I've started to hear from a few other people that were involved in Snow White or were involved in her operations. But she's happy. She's finally able to speak out loud. And she's still very involved. I'll write a story and she'll be immediately emailing me about it. I have a website I call The Underground Bunker. I think I'm the only journalist in the world masochistic enough to write about the Church of Scientology every day. And I've had a lot of fun doing that. I feel like I'm in the front row at an amazing show, and I'm just trying to document what happens. I'm often asked what's going to happen with the Church of Scientology. And I just don't know. That's why I'm reporting. You know, I'm really curious. David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology, is overseeing a dwindling organization with only about 40,000 people, but he's also sitting on a mountain of cash. And so how does that resolve itself? I just don't know, and that's why I'm trying to keep an eye on things. The nice thing about the momentum of the bunker is I have people all over the world who send me things. I literally have too much stuff right now. When I left my hotel room this afternoon, I was trying to decide of the 5 things that have been sent to me in the last day, which of them I'm going to use for tomorrow's story. So, which is a great position to be in. I'm really happy about that, and I can't tell you about them, but you're going to love them when they come out. They're great stories. So, a lot of things happening in Scientology right now. I mean, this whole Tom Cruise thing is fascinating, and Star Magazine says he's leaving. I don't think he is, but I'm really interested to see what reporters ask him when this movie press caravan starts up. I was very fortunate enough to be included in the movie Going Clear that was on HBO earlier this year, and it hit Tom hard, didn't it? Those of you saw it? Wow. Alex used me for some of that Tom stuff, and I had no idea he was going to put him on the spot like that. But it is hard to understand why he, I'd like to see some journalists ask him some of those questions. We had just a news story this morning that was pretty devastating about him. But Scientology is a very small organization, but it gets a lot more attention than other small organizations because it has some celebrities, because it's secretive, and because it has some very odd, arcane beliefs. And I'm just fascinated by it, and I'm glad to see so many of you are too. How about some questions about Scientology anybody wants to ask? Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
I'll repeat it after you tell.
So I got interested in Scientology because my son was reading the book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And he was reading that, and I had just found your blog, and I was reading your blog, and something clicked, and they matched.
Yeah, the questions about the Nazis. And if you ask Paulette, why was she so into this book and why did she keep going, she will tell you it has to do with her childhood. She has told me she thinks to herself, what if more people in the 1930s had spoken up about what was happening in Europe at that time? Would her parents still be alive? And that thought helped her with what she was doing with Scientology, because she thinks there are a lot of parallels. A totalitarian organization based on information control, that the people in it are convinced they're saving the world and helping mankind, and once they buy into that, they're capable of incredible acts that once they leave, they think, how could I have done that? And I think that's what Alex was trying to do in his film. Is he really, he had Paul Haggis, he had Jason Begay, Spanky Taylor, Mike Render, and he wanted people to see that they're intelligent, creative people that get sucked up in an organization like that, and then they're capable of just remarkable activities because they are convinced that L. Ron Hubbard discovered the actual secret of the nature of existence. We are living on a prison planet. We are unable to see it, and the two biggest beings on the planet are Tom Cruise and David Miscavige. They literally believe that, which is why he's so sucked into it. Yeah.
So what are the techniques they use to convince people of that? How come they get convinced?
You know, I did a series at the website called Up the Bridge with Claire Headley. I think people generally knew that Scientology is this pay-as-you-go organization with increasing levels that cost more and more money. But I was curious, what are those levels? What's in them? What do they cost? And so over a full year, Claire Headley and I went through each course, each level, and talked about what's in it, what did Hubbard say in it, what did it cost, and then the cumulative cost. And I thought it was fascinating because a lot of former Scientologists will tell you that yes, when you get to the higher levels, it gets really insane and very controlling, but those initial courses are wonderful. I wish it would just be those. Those were great. But Claire showed and demonstrated how those initial courses are where the indoctrination begins to be laid in. And that very soon a Scientologist is convinced that everything good in their life comes from Scientology. Everything bad in their life comes from their own mistakes. And they reinforce that, and they reinforce that. There's this policy called Keeping Scientology Working, KSW. And you see Tom Cruise talk about that in his black turtleneck video from 2008. It says, KSW, KSW, what a policy. And they're all made to read that and recite it over and over and over. And the point of KSW is just that Scientology can only come from one source, L. Ron Hubbard. It has to be his material to the letter. Anybody who is veering from that must be corrected, and everything good in your life comes from that. And like I said, that indoctrination is laid in very early. And so I find that, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that only a very small percentage of people ever get into this, right? Most of us, they come up to you and they say, oh, you've got problems in your life? We have a check sheet for that. That wouldn't work with me. I don't know about the rest of you. I don't buy that. But some people love the certainty that they have, right? We have a check sheet that will improve your life. We have a book that will take care of all your problems. I find that people tend to go in at a very vulnerable time in their lives. So a guy like Bruce Hines, for example, who I finally got to meet this week in Denver, he was a physicist when he got into Scientology. But he'd just been through a very bad breakup. And Scientology says, well, we can take care of that for you. And I think, that's why people first sign up. And then once, you get through this level and you get through this check sheet and things still aren't working in your life, there's the next level. And it becomes like a video game. I haven't unlocked this secret yet, And at the very top is OT8. And Claire would tell me that if you were only through the grades, oh, wait till you get to the OTs. Well, I'm OT2. Oh, but you haven't been through OT3. You see? And Paul Haggis explains this in the movie Going Clear. He says, okay, this wasn't so good, but the next one's supposed to be great. And it's always that sort of carrot that they're holding out to you that draws people forward until, suddenly they're OT8. They've given $500,000 to the Church of Scientology. I think it's very difficult for them at that point to say, oh, this was all a mistake. It's very difficult for them at that point. Yeah.
The BBC4 did a documentary that it seemed to be like after Going Clear. And it followed this biracial couple that was being harassed by the squirrel busters.
Yeah, that was Channel 4, not BBC4. That came out about a year and a half before Going Clear. I'm in that one too. They're a Texas couple, Marty Rathman and Monique Rathman.
Yes.
Marty's a fascinating figure. He was the number 2 person in the Church of Scientology. He had left in 2004. He's the one that got Tom Cruise back in. Something that we didn't know at the time was that after Tom got together with Nicole Kidman, they drifted away from Scientology for years, but they kept that hidden. And when those two broke up, David Miscavige made it job one to get Tom Cruise back in, and it was Marty's job to do that. So from 2000 to 2003, Marty Rathbun was intensely auditing Tom Cruise and turned him into the most gung-ho Scientologist. That's when they had that celebration for him in October 2004, gave him that big giant medal called the Freedom Medal of Valor, and had that video that got leaked 4 years later with him in the black turtleneck. But right at that time, 2004, Marty left for good. He left so completely. There were rumors online that he died. He just vanished. He finally surfaced again in 2008, 2009, started a blog, started criticizing Miscavige, and it was like, I'm convinced that Marty Rathbun's blog was the single biggest challenge to the existence of the Church of Scientology in those years. I mean, Miscavige had to do something. So he sent these waves of private investigators and attorneys down to South Texas. They were in Ingleside by the Bay, across from Corpus Christi. And they were just intimidation squads. They were goon squads. They hung out on his porch every day, out in front of his house, followed them to the restaurant. And Monique finally got sick of it. We didn't know this at the time. They kept it very quiet, but they had adopted a baby boy, or they'd arranged to. And Monique said, I can't have these spies on us all the time if we're going to be raising a child. And so she then went and filed a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology in August 2013, alleging harassment. And she sued David Miscavige, the leader of the church. And a couple of reasons why it's such a significant lawsuit. First of all, that Miscavige is named, but also Monique was never in the Church of Scientology. If Marty sues, they just say, look, this is a free speech fight, tough. But Monique was never in the church. So it's a fascinating lawsuit. The Channel 4 documentary is called Scientologists at War, and it documents the bizarre group called the Squirrel Busters. Unfortunately, we're all just waiting right now because in September last year, the church appealed it on what's called an anti-slap motion. And I have to tell you about that for just a minute because I don't know if you're familiar with an anti-slap motion is, but it was developed, I think California was one of the first states that got it. It was developed specifically with the Church of Scientology in mind, because when Scientology would use lawsuits just as another harassment tool. And so do other big bullies. Big corporations will often sue someone that's protesting them just to get them to shut up. And lawsuits are expensive, and it can be a good tool for shutting down protest. So these laws were put in place around the country so that you can go into court and say, look, Judge, Monsanto has sued me because they don't like my picket signs. It's not a real lawsuit. It's just a farce. I want you to make them prove it's a real lawsuit, and if they can't, dismiss it now before we get into discovery and all this expensive stuff. The judge then looks at it, looks at the plaintiff submits their brief, and if the judge agrees, the lawsuit's done. And the bully may have to pay money. I remember I used an anti-slap once with somebody that was messing with us at The Voice. In Texas, the Church of Scientology has filed an anti-slap motion saying that Monique Rathbun is bullying them and keeping them from their First Amendment speech rights. It's turning a law on its head, which Scientology is so good at. This appeal was, the judge in Comal County, Texas said no, but they appealed it in July 2014. They had oral arguments in September 2014, and let's see, October, November, 10 months later, we've heard nothing from the Texas Third Court of Appeals. I have an expert here in Texas who's an expert in appeals. He knows that court, and he tells me he's mystified. He doesn't know what's going on, and all he can tell me is they must be having a really difficult time. And I have to admit, if you read Scientology's briefs on that, they hire the best. You know who they hired as their attorney on that brief? Your former Chief Justice of the state of Texas. That's the kind of money Scientology throws at these things. So I don't know how that's going to go, but to me, it's one of the most interesting fights in the country, and that initial harassment by the Squirrel Busters in April 2011 is what. Oh yeah, somebody said Squirrel Busters. What does it mean? In Scientology, if you have to follow the words of L. Ron Hubbard in his organization. If you leave the Church of Scientology and continue to do auditing and these other counseling, and basically using L. Ron Hubbard's ideas outside of the official church, you're called a squirrel. You're squirreling the tech. There's no worse thing you can call a Scientologist. Marty had left. He was doing some counseling at home, so that made him a squirrel. And so this goon squad showed up with these T-shirts that had a picture of Marty's head on a squirrel's body with the slash sign through it, and they called themselves the Squirrel Busters. It was just a goon squad. It was meant to intimidate them. And when that was happening in April 2011, I started writing about it. I was in New York at the Village Voice, and I was the only one covering it. And that's when I thought, I think there's enough going on around the world. I could put something online about Scientology every day. Oh, God. Why don't know? 4 years later. People ask me, do you want to stop doing that? I'm like, every day.
So my question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right.
It's hard to imagine that I could be harassed to that point. How effective is it and how common is it?
Scientology went into that. That's another reason why that court case is so fascinating. Is that they, in order to keep Miscavige out of it, the Church of Scientology is made up of dozens and dozens of individual entities. It's an alphabet soup. One of which is called the Church of Scientology International, CSI. But it's not even the most top one, but it's called the Church of Scientology International. The Church of Scientology International fell on its sword, hoping to keep Miscavige out. They came to court and stipulated, yes, we hire attorneys, we hire private investigators, we follow people, we follow former members, we track them, and they said it's part of our religion. I just thought that was the first time since the Snow White prosecutions in 1979 that Scientology had stipulated to something like that. I thought it was stunning. But the Church of Scientology is now officially on record that if you leave, it's their religion to follow you and harass you and track you and disrupt your life. And they admitted to that in court. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you knew anything about Werner Erhard and his involvement in, he was like the S training guy. I've been doing some landmark courses and I've been kind of reading up on what this all was about. And
most Scientologists will tell you that Werner Erhard was involved in Scientology, and he's one of many people who took some ideas from Scientology and then went to do his own thing. I spend so much time keeping an eye on Scientology. I don't spend a lot of time on the splinter groups and outgrowths. But I don't think there's any question that Erhard got some of his ideas from Scientology and then went to go do EST and Landmark Forum. But I feel unqualified to say more than that about that.
When we were in RTC, EST, one of Erhard's group, was one of the top squirrel groups, quote unquote. It was a targeted enemy.
It drove Hubbard nuts. And you have to think about this for a second. Scientology all began because L. Ron Hubbard put out a book on May 9th, 1950, and the title was Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. And he claims in it that he is the first person to discover how the human mind actually works. And he's also discovered a kind of counseling to help you get through all the problems in life. Well, if it was really a science, the way science works is even if there's somebody that makes a great discovery, somebody else should be able to come along and replicate that and do it on their own. It happens all the time. But he was insanely jealous if anybody came along and said that they were taking some ideas from Hubbard and doing their own versions of it. And so in 1965, he decided to clamp down on these breakaway groups And that's when he started what he called ethics. It's such a wonderful word. It's actually Scientology's idea of control, but it's the way of that's when you got the idea of squirrels, and you have to be in the church using Hubbard's actual materials. You cannot do it any other way. But I think S was definitely considered one. Yeah, in the back.
Hey, Tony. Something I've been researching it for a long time, and I've never found out. What happened to the original Sea Org vessels? Like the Apollo, the Diana, the Athena, went after Operation Normandy? Where did those ships go?
I think they were just scrapped, weren't they, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the Apollo was scrapped, and they ripped out a bunch of stuff in the museum in Clearwater.
The question's about. Yeah, the question is about the ships. So in 1965, Hubbard clamped down on breakaway groups. By then, he had left the United States and he was living in England. And he had great success there from 59 to about 66. But then he started to feel some pressure from the British government. Wherever he went, people started noticing the less savory aspects of Scientology. And so he wanted to get out of the United Kingdom at that time. He'd already been sort of kicked out of the United States. And he had been a Navy veteran in World War II. So in 1967, he came up with something he called the Sea Project. They purchased 3 ships, refurbished them, and set sail. And from 1967 to 1975, L. Ron Hubbard literally ran the Church of Scientology from a ship called the Apollo in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and then ultimately the Caribbean. Finally he got sick of it, and in 1975, except for one period, in 1973 they put the Apollo in dry dock for repairs. They were in Morocco for a while, and then he came to New York. And I was, one of the things you have to do when you do a book like this is do a timeline so you know when everything happened. And it dawned on me that from December 72 to September 73, the absolute worst time of Paulette Cooper's harassment, depression, and close to suicide, Hubbard was living 5 miles away in Queens. And it dawned on me. I've actually talked to, Hubbard basically just hid out in an apartment in Queens for 10 months. That's when he wrote the Snow White Project that started that whole burglarizing scheme. And he was with 2 other men, and one of them is still alive. And he actually talked to me. I've talked to him numerous times. And we talked about what it was like to live with Hubbard in New York in 73, and what an odd character he was. But anyway, the question was, what happened to those 3 ships? Once, in 75, he was sick and tired of it. They wanted to come back to the United States. They surreptitiously took over the town of Clearwater, Florida. He had called the Apollo his flagship. So to this day, Clearwater, Florida is called Flag by Scientologists. They're still wearing their naval uniforms. They're still calling each other captain and lieutenant. All the women in the Sea Org are still referred to as sir. And yeah, they call themselves the Sea Organization even today. And I think those 3 ships were scrapped. And, Hubbard died in 86, and then Miscavige decided to get his own little navy, and so in 88, he launched the Free Winds. So today, again, I don't know about the other churches, but these guys have a spy wing and they have a cruise ship. And their cruise ship, the Free Winds, is looking old. It goes from Aruba to Bonaire to Curacao, ABC. And I mentioned those levels that you go through. The top level in Scientology is called OT8. It takes you about $500,000 to get there altogether. OT8 by itself is about 10 grand. You can only get OT8 on the ship. And there are so few people getting it now that they're holding all kinds of other seminars on the ship just to pay for their costs. And these days with the internet, any ship that's big enough, you can basically keep track of it 24 hours a day anywhere in the world. So I'm constantly getting sent images of the Free Winds from my readers, and it's not looking good. If you look at the front of that ship, those big plates, they're very dimpled. So I think that ship, he's going to have to do something sooner or later about replacing that one. Yeah.
It's Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of
of Islam now as Scientology?
Yeah, that's a great question asked by Francois I know him from Orange County. He's a very well-known person who protested against Scientology. Francois asked, what about the Nation of Islam? This is really strange. About the mid of 2005 or so, Jason Begay told me he was in a limo with David Miscavige, I think, and said something to him about how white Scientology is. Can't we do something about this? And Janet Reitman in her book wrote that Isaac Hayes at one time had said something to Miscavige about the thing is just too expensive. You know, we're just not going to get more black people. So.
Well, Isaac also got a message today that Miscavige that Scientology, if it didn't have any black people, could never be hit.
Yeah, well, David has said numerous things about that. In Jaffa, he said something hilarious. But anyway, about a year later, around 2006, one African American member they do have who's very flamboyant, very visible, is named Alfredi Johnson in Los Angeles. He's a Baptist minister and Scientologist. And he started bringing around Louis Farrakhan to Scientology events. And I have a photograph from 2006 with Alfredi, Minister Farrakhan, and Stacey Francis, the singer, hanging out at the Celebrity Center. And sometime after that, Farrakhan had this revelation that the whitest man who ever lived, L. Ron Hubbard, was onto something about the human mind, and he started asking members of the Nation of Islam to start doing Book One auditing, which means auditing from the Dianetics book, which is the kind of auditing that doesn't require an e-meter. E-meters cost $5,000 each. So it just costs the price of a Dianetics book. And it's been suggested that perhaps Minister Farrakhan gets a little bit of a piece of that action. I don't have anything confirmed on that. But today, virtually all Nation of Islam members are auditing Dianetics from Book One. So a few of them are starting to take Scientology courses. But I don't know where this is going. I still think it's kind of a weird sideshow because I don't see Nation of Islam members becoming Sea Org members, and I don't see Scientologists at Nation of Islam rallies. That's not going to happen. So I don't know where that's going, but it's just these two odd, very different groups are having this, interaction with each other. Yeah.
So would you classify like Scientologists as a form of Christianity or as a cult?
Well, I'm going to take that in two parts. The question is Scientology a form of Christianity, and is it a cult? This is what L. Ron Hubbard said about Jesus Christ. He said that Jesus is an implant that was put into our minds by a 75 million year old alien race. And he's actually heard on tape saying there was no Jesus Christ. So when people tell you that you can be a Christian and be a Scientologist, I don't really think that's true. So no, it's not a form of Christianity at all. Is it a cult? I tend not to use that word, and the reason I don't is it's such a word that has no fixed meaning. I pay attention to what they do, and what they do is they split up families, they bankrupt people. For decades, they forced young women to have abortions. This is a group that needs to be watched. Now, whether a cult or not, I see these forums online where people endlessly argue whether it's a cult or not. I think the problem is, what's a cult? It's just really hard to define, and I find that argument not useful. This is a high control group whose teachings that you go through are very much about information control. It's a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. One of the reasons, people have asked me what's the result of Going Clear. Well, Going Clear has certainly raised the awareness of Scientology with a whole new audience we never had before. But most Scientologists have probably done a good job avoiding it entirely, and that's because they know the consequences. If Dad dares to watch Going Clear on HBO, someone in the family is probably going to snitch on him, because that's what you do in Scientology. You file what's called a knowledge report. If a knowledge report is filed on Dad for watching Going Clear, he'll be hauled down to ethics and given what's called a security check, a sec check. It can last 3 weeks, at which point he's then given a bill for $4,000 or $5,000 and possibly kicked out. So Scientologists are really good at not watching things that they're not supposed to watch, because they know that can happen. I just had one of my favorite stories of the year that we did at the bunker was a woman named Sylvia DeWall was hauled into ethics because she had watched Leah Remini on Dancing with the Stars. And she had watched Lawrence Wright interviewed on television. These were the crimes that landed her in a 3-week interrogation that she had to pay $4,500 for, and ultimately got her kicked out of the church. And she was married to a guy who was such an enthusiastic Scientologist, his nickname was literally Mr. Church. And she was interrogated, she was told all this about her declare in a room in Flag, and all those rooms were always wired, and I'm fortunate enough that a recording was smuggled to me. You can actually hear her being told that these crimes are resulting in her being kicked out. And she tells this young ethics officer, do you know what you've just done to my life? My husband is now going to have to divorce me. Because he would have no choice. Once she's declared a suppressive person and kicked out of the church, every other Scientologist then has to cut off all ties with her, or they'll be kicked out too. So she came home, and Mr. Church took one look at her and said, you were declared, weren't you? And she said, yeah. And he then did what a Scientologist does. He said, I'm going to sit down and examine the data. And he sat there and he thought about it, and he told me, Tony, I decided that my wife was more important to me than a church. And he left too. And they moved, and I mean, it was a big thing for them because they had a house painting business and all of their clients were Scientologists. So they not only lost this organization and all of their friends, who all then had to cut them off, they lost their business, and they were, I think in their late 40s, early 50s, they had grown children. They moved to Arizona, started up a new business, and then moved again to Denver 3 days before I got there, and I got to meet them. And I'm just really rooting for them because they, you know, he stuck by her, and some other Scientologists might not. Francois.
Can you briefly tell us about the RPF?
Yeah. So not only can people get kicked out like that, but a lot of Scientologists join what's called the Sea Org. I mentioned it before. It requires a billion-year contract. They tend to prey on the children of Scientologists. I've talked to Scientologists who signed their billion-year contract as young as 7 years old. And Laura DiCrescenzo, when she was 12 in the Sea Org, was working 90 hours a week for pennies an hour. When she was 13, they moved her to the adult schedule of 112 hours a week. And if you mess up in some way, and it can be very capricious, you then go on the prison program, which is called the Rehabilitation Project Force, RPF. They're eating table scraps. They're running from place to place. They wear boiler outfits. They can't talk to anybody. And the RPF was like this, okay, you go through this tough thing for a few months, and then you'll think better, and then you can join the regular population. Now the RPF takes years. I talked to Chuck Beatty. He was in the RPF for 7 years. He told me that on Millennium Night, December 31st, 1999, when I'm sure all of you and I was out partying, he was in the desert in the RPF and knew that this monumental thing was happening and it was time for him to go to bed. Anyway, so there's a lot of, I could go on and on, but there's lots to drink, and I need to sign some books. And I want to thank you again, Houston. You really outdid Dallas, and I'm so happy about that.